Good morning. It's December 21st, and this is To My Liberal Friends, and today is the winter solstice. Well, how many of you think the southern border is secure? If you listen to Joe Biden and his administration officials, you would think that it would be almost impossible to come across the border illegally. In August, White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre was quizzed about the border and gave this incredulous answer, and I quote her, "The president has done more to secure the border and to deal with this issue of immigration than anybody else. He really has," end quote. She actually said this with a straight face and probably believes it because she read it in her briefing book. And anyone watching her press conferences knows that every answer she gives comes from the briefing book she's been given. I don't think she communicates much with Joe Biden on a personal level, but instead is just giving her marching orders and comes out to talk to the press. Well, earlier this year, Homeland Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas said basically the same thing in a White House briefing when he clearly stated, quote, "I want to be very clear. Our borders are not open," end quote. Now, how many of you believe that? For years, Democrats across the country have been supported illegal immigration. Blue states and cities have declared themselves sanctuaries for immigrants. They've prohibited law enforcement from cooperating with ICE. Even when illegal immigrants commit crimes, some of them felonies, they're not allowed to turn them over to federal authorities. But as they say, something happened along the way to the church. Now, Joe Biden sent a pretty clear signal that he would eliminate the policies of his predecessor on how immigrants crossing the border were treated. To those waiting to cross the border, he said, "Come on in, we're now open." And they believed him. He's actually called the immigration president by immigrants. And come they did. The number of illegal border crossings at the northern and southern borders and all ports of entry since January 2021 totals more than 8 million people, greater than the individual population of 38 U.S. states. Put another way, the number of foreign nationals from all over the world believed to be primarily illegally entering the U.S. is comparable to the populations of 8 Delawares, 4 New Mexicos, 2 Oklahomas, and more than 13 Wyomings, all put together. Since Joe Biden took office, we've seen over 8 million encounters by the Border Patrol, and that does not count the evaded detection known as getaways. They would be approximately 1.7 million more. And most experts say the total has grown to just over 10 million, and there are thousands more on the way. Every day, thousands try to cross. For a border that's secure, it looks pretty porous to the average American. The governors, particularly Greg Abbott of Texas, of the border states finally said enough is enough. And they've been shouldering this cost and burden, so they adopted a new tactic. They started transporting illegal immigrants to northern cities, specifically those that call themselves sanctuary cities. Suddenly, those cities had to start paying to feed, house, and provide medical care for these immigrants. And it was no longer just a southern border problem. In New York City, they're spending $10 million per day on these costs. And they're appropriating buildings and hotels that used to be there for citizens because they need space. In Chicago, they spent over $140 million for the care of immigrants. And the people in those cities are now angry that they're being denied services by the city to fund these illegal immigrants. The result has been these elected officials in states and cities have been forced to care for these immigrants. They're now calling for the Biden administration and demanding they do something. First, they want more federal dollars. In the end, they're finally saying that something has to be done about the open border. Now, normally this would fall on deaf ears to Democrats in Washington. But 2024 is an election year, and there are multiple vulnerable Democrats who suddenly view this as an issue that has to find a resolution. Republicans have been clamoring for a tighter border for the entire Biden administration, only to be called racist and xenophobic. The House has acted on immigration and passed a bill last May that would restart border wall construction and place new restrictions on asylum claims. The bill also has a provision that will require all employers to electronically verify all new hires to ensure they're legally allowed to be employed in the country. Well, Democrats all voted against the bill at that time, but the tide's starting to shift. As I mentioned, this has become an issue with Democrats, and they finally have to deal with it, and Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer agreed to begin negotiations on a deal that would include more aid to Ukraine in exchange for tightened immigration policies. Now, they were unable to get a deal this week, and Congress and both the House and Senate have adjourned for the holidays, but they promised they're going to keep negotiating during the holidays and come back and take this up. And one of the expected parts of the deal would allow the government to summarily expel migrants when border crossings reach a certain level, and a new policy that would allow for a speedy deportation for those immigrants who lose their cases in court. This has been a problem since under Biden, those immigrants giving themselves up at the border are simply released into the country, given a court date, that might be over a year away, and this allows these immigrants to simply disappear in many cases into society, and some appear and some don't. They realize they don't have a strong case for asylum, and they're here simply for economic reasons. Both Republicans and Democrats seem to agree that the rules for asylum need to be tightened because under Biden, the percentage of approvals has almost doubled. And that's still a number that hovers around 50%, and the question of those denied or being deported is a questionable number. Many are just disappearing. The Biden administration, seeing the polling numbers where 80% of the people disapprove of his handling the border crisis, yes, even the administration finally admits that it's a crisis, is now signaling they're willing to compromise with Republicans. And this is not without pitfalls, since the Congressional Hispanic Caucus has voiced opposition to any deal that changes the asylum system and immigration policies. But even they have to admit that the people crossing the border are coached on what to say just to get in, and they don't have a solution of their own to put forward. The bottom line is this become an election year problem for both vulnerable congressional Democrats and for Joe Biden, so suddenly they're ready to take some action and cut a deal. This has been To My Liberal Friends. Thanks for listening.